Hello YouTube. I just watched some videos by Conference Report and Gary Edwards on the question of consciousness. Well, uh, Conference Reports was on um, really explicitly on consciousness, and Gary Edwards was on quote unquote physicalism. And both of them sort of got me thinking. Um, Gary's in particular got me thinking because I always think about this issue of idealism versus materialism or physicalism or however you want to say it. Um, I always think about that question, and for me, it's not a clear cut either or, right? I don't see how you could define that as a clear cut either or. Um, and one way to articulate this problem, but it's a little bit more in line with my predilection for German idealism, um, is to say that this is really a question about the relation between the subject and the object, right? The idealist says that the object comes first, or excuse me, the idealist says that the subject comes first, and in some sense constitutes the object, whereas the physicalist says that the object comes first and constitutes the subject. And I think that both views, or both of those statements, is in some sense lacking. I don't think either is really satisfactory. Uh, and why is that not? Why is neither one satisfactory? Well, I find myself thinking very much, and Gary Edwards brought up the issue of intentionality, right, which predates someone like Edmund Husserl, but I'll draw on Husserl because it takes center stage in his philosophy. Um, Husserl makes this move, which it's sort of a methodological statement, I think, for what he was defining as phenomenology. But I think it's an interesting move because the question of the subject-object divide ends up being sort of shifted, right? And we begin with the central question of ontology. We begin with the question, well, what is being, right? What does it mean to be, right? And I think that there are lots of different answers to this question, and there are different ways of approaching this question, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what I would say is that conceiving of the subject-object divide as an either-or is not actually necessary for coming at that problem. Husserl basically says, listen, isn't all we mean when we say that something is, right, that something exists, that something appears, right? So something is only in as much as it appears, for Husserl and into the phenomenological tradition. And I find that extremely convincing, right? I think that it makes sense to say that. I think that when we use the word is, what we're referring to is something that we encounter either, and when I use the word appears, right, it's the metaphysical conception of appearance, right? It doesn't have anything to do with the visual per se, but rather it's more to do with we cognize or perceive or intuit or whatever you like. And something is only in as much as it appears in that broader sense. That's convincing to me. I buy that. But once you say that, though, aren't you kind of forced into an idealist paradigm, right? Because being is contingent on appearance, and the category of appearance only makes sense if there is one for things to appear to, right? So, in some sense, this looks idealist, right? Because it looks like what's being said here is that the subject in some way constitutes the object. And I'm sort of fine with that, right? Um, that sort of makes sense to me. We talk about, when we talk about appearance, we might also smuggle in talk about qualia or whatever you like. And you might be able to think about building an idealist case that way. But the object exists only in as much as it's confronted by a subject. But on the other hand, we have the other side of the coin, which is intentionality, right? Aboutness, which Gary also talks about. Subjectivity, right, or agency, if you like, or consciousness, is defined by its structure of intentionality. Again, this is true for Husserl. So I am a subject only in as much as I am a subject only in as much as my consciousness or my subjectivity is about something other than my subjectivity. So when we introduce intentionality into this formula, then it seems like we are now in a physicalist paradigm, or at least that it can't quite be said coherently that all that exists is mind. Because mind, in order to be mind, has to be about something that is other than itself, right? So, on the one hand, it doesn't strike me to be coherent to talk about the subject in the absence of the object, right? That is to say, it doesn't make sense to me to simply throw in with an idealist paradigm because of intentionality, right? Because intentionality is so much at the heart of what it is to be a subject, right? And I know Gary used intentionality, following other philosophers, he used intentionality as part of a case for idealism, but I think really it implies that there is something non-mental, right? And again, I don't think it really makes sense to talk about the object unless the object is confronted by a subject, right? This is kind of a Kantian position. So, in our subject-object paradigm, then, it seems like simply throwing in with one or the other is weak, right? It seems like they're in order to come to grips with our relation to the world, we need to treat the subject-object paradigm a little bit more sort of dialectically, right? Now, again, all of this is very much contingent on accepting a phenomenological paradigm of what it means to be, right? Which opens up all sorts of cans of worms if you read someone like Levinas, for instance. Because you end up with what Levinas would call otherwise than being, right? Or non-being, or some surplus that seems to be left over, right? If we were to delete all appearances, it seems like it wouldn't delete reality. So we have this sort of black box, right? This leftover, which I find particularly interesting. But yeah, so then how do we get at the problem? How do we get at the subject-object divide in such a way where in which we are not simply stating I am an idealist or I am a materialist, right? You present arguments for one or the other. And that's a difficult problem. I don't want to say that's a hard problem, because that could lead to confusion. That's a difficult problem. one way to get at it, I think, is by simply stating that the first person frame of reference and the third person frame of reference, right? If we talk subjectively or if we talk objectively, these are essentially two different ways of talking about the world, right? At that point, it doesn't strike me as being necessary to suggest that one is primary, right? One happens before the other, or something like that. Because, again, what does it mean for the physical to come before the mental, right? I mean, it seems to me that physicality is very much let's say it's always already mental, right? And it seems to me that the mental is always already physical. We are embodied, right? Our embodiment is a condition of possibility for the mental. So instead of thinking of the subject-object paradigm as being this is the primary, right? Or it is out of this thing that this other thing arises, right? It is out of the object that the subject arises, or vice versa. Can we not look at these two as being contingent on each other, right? Or conditions of possibility for each other? In which case, you might say that the subject and object are roughly two sides of the same coin. That again, we have two different schemes of language for talking about. And it doesn't strike me as being necessary to talk about reduction at that point. And I don't really like this word reduction. I think that the word reduction kind of bewitches people, right? There's a lot of talk about, can the mental reduce to the physical, or can the physical reduce to the mental? And I think that statement, right, or that word reduction, assumes a certain paradigm of knowledge, right? Again, it assumes a sort of foundationalist paradigm of knowledge, because we're talking about, like, the word reduce has a certain spatiality to it, right? To bring something down to, right? To make something more fundamental, right? And I don't think that the task should be to conceive of trying to get at which is more primary, but perhaps we can talk about the physical in terms of the mental. Perhaps we can talk about the mental in terms of the physical, without necessarily trying to get at the primacy of anything. One more thought from Husserl is that when Husserl begins his phenomenological sort of investigations, or his inquiries, one thing that he comes to very, very quickly is that subject-object paradigm is not sufficient to come to grips with intentionality, right? He needs to invent a third category, right? Which is the intentional object, right? Which is not properly an object. In some sense, it's contingent on the subject, but it's also not, like, fully constituted by the subject. It doesn't make sense to say that either. So he needs to put something in between the two, in order to make sense of first-person experience. And that's important, I think. That's an important lesson. I am very skeptical about the idea that we can come to grips with consciousness and its relation to the world through the lens of a classical subject-object paradigm. It seems to me that you need to sort of break apart that binary in one way or another. So yeah, that's my totally uneducated opinion on idealism and materialism and how that relates to philosophy of mind. And have a good day.